The ocean has always been a chaotic, murderous void governed by physics and brutality. But humanity, in its infinite arrogance, decided that what the high seas really needed was more paperwork. For centuries, we have tried to tame the Atlantic with bureaucracy and fight hurricanes with superstition. From the lethal absurdity of the British Royal Navy to the petty tyrannies of modern cruise lines, the history of maritime law is a testament to our collective madness. We are charting a course through the 50 most baffling, dangerous, and hilariously stupid regulations ever enforced. Welcome to the Ship of Fools. 1. The Breadfruit Mutiny. The single dumbest rule in maritime history didn't just annoy the crew, it triggered the world's most famous mutiny. On the HMS Bounty, Captain William Bligh was tasked with transporting breadfruit plants. Bligh became so obsessively enamored with this cargo that he instituted a rule prioritizing the plants over the people. He ordered that the saplings receive freshwater rations while his crew drank slime or went thirsty. Armed guards were stationed not to protect the officers, but to stop dehydrated sailors from stealing a sip from a potted plant. It was the ultimate bureaucratic insult, a legal declaration that a salad ingredient had a higher rank than a human being. This rule wasn't just strict, it was the spark that burned the Bounty down. 2. The Titanic Calculation. For a shockingly long time, the rules regarding lifeboats were written by accountants who had apparently never seen water. The regulation stated that a ship's lifeboat capacity was determined by the vessel's tonnage, not the number of human souls on board. This creates a terrifying mathematical blind spot. It explains why the Titanic, in 1912, was technically fully compliant with the law while steaming toward an iceberg with enough boats for only half its passengers. It is a grim reminder that regulations are often reactive, written in blood only after the disaster has already happened. The law essentially said, if your ship is heavy enough, we don't care how many people drown. 3. The Admiral's Marinade. The regulations for handling corpses at sea were brutally pragmatic, yet strangely culinary. While common sailors were tossed overboard, high-ranking officers required preservation for a state funeral. The official solution? Pickling. The body was stuffed into a cask of the ship's strongest spirit, usually rum or brandy. This practice reached its peak grotesquerie after the Battle of Trafalgar, when Admiral Nelson's body was transported home in a barrel of brandy. The horror lies in the rumor that sailors, desperate for a drink, would tap the barrel and unknowingly drink the Nelson's blood. The rule turned the ship's liquor cabinet into a temporary morgue and the crew into accidental cannibals. 4. The Plimsoll Loophole. In the 19th century, coffin ships, rotting vessels overloaded for profit, were a plague. To stop owners from drowning crews for insurance payouts, a law required a Plimsoll line painted on the hull to mark the safe loading limit. It was a brilliant, life-saving concept, immediately ruined by a single clause. The original law allowed the ship owners themselves to decide where to paint the line. Cut 2, a greedy tycoon painting the line on the smokestack, effectively legalizing the sinking of his own ship. It was a regulation that handed the keys to the asylum directly to the lunatics, proving that a safety law with a loophole is just a death sentence with better branding. 5. Legalized kidnapping. For centuries, the British Royal Navy operated under a rule that was essentially state-sponsored abduction. Known as impressment, this regulation gave the Navy the legal right to send gangs into port cities to beat men unconscious and drag them onto warships. It wasn't a draft, it was a manhunt. This created a paradoxical nightmare where merchant sailors, men who made their living at sea, were terrified to set foot on land. They would stay trapped on their ships for years, hiding in the harbor, because stepping onto the dock meant being pressed into a floating hell. The government had legalized the theft of human lives to protect the concept of freedom. 6. The Scraped Tongue. Naval discipline was governed by the Articles of War, a document that treated minor annoyances as capital crimes. While mutiny got you hanged, the rules for trivial offenses were creatively sadistic. On many ships, swearing was strictly forbidden by regulation. The punishment for dropping an F-bomb wasn't a fine. It was having your tongue scraped with a rough piece of metal until it bled. Alternatively, you might be forced to stand on deck for hours wearing a humiliating sign. It was a disciplinary system that meted out torture for bad language, turning the bosun into a violent schoolmarm with a license to maim. 7. The Three-Keeper Rule. Lighthouse regulations were often written in the ink of pure psychological horror. Originally, lighthouses were manned by 2 keepers. This rule changed forever after a grim incident in 1801 at the Smalls Lighthouse. One keeper, Thomas Griffith, died in a freak accident. His partner, Thomas Howell, fearing he would be accused of murder if he tossed the body, built a makeshift coffin and lashed it to the outside railing. For weeks, the wind blew the coffin against the glass, making the corpse beckon to him. Howell went insane. The authority immediately instituted a new rule: never 2 keepers, always 3. A regulation born solely to dilute the madness of isolation. 8. The Silent Service. In the pressurized metal tube of a submarine, silence is not a courtesy. It is the difference between life and death. The rig for ultra-quiet rule is one of the most stressful regulations in modern warfare. A dropped wrench or a slammed toilet seat creates a sound transient that travels miles through the water, lighting up enemy sonar like a flare. This means a 19-year-old mechanic with buttery fingers holds the fate of a billion-dollar vessel in his hands. It is the only workplace on Earth where shut-up is a legally binding order tied to national security, turning a sneeze into a potential act of treason. 9. The Yellow Jack. A simple square of yellow cloth remains one of the most terrifying regulatory symbols in maritime history. International rules dictate that flying the Yellow Jack signals a ship is under quarantine. It is a universal scream for help that translates to, "We are rotting from the inside, stay away." This flag had the legal power to freeze commerce. A single piece of fabric could trap a crew on their floating petri dish for months, banned from entering any port, watching each other die of cholera or yellow fever. It was a regulatory death sentence that turned a ship into a ghost before it even sank. 10. The 40-Day Stare. The very concept of quarantine began as a rigid maritime rule in 14th century Venice. The law demanded that ships from plague-ridden areas anchor offshore for 40 days, quaranta giorni. The stupidity lay in the bureaucracy's blindness. Even if a ship arrived with a clearly healthy crew and a clean log, the clock started. Men sat within sight of their homes, staring at the docks for over a month, prisoners of a calendar. It was a rule that prioritized the appearance of safety over medical reality, proving that even in the Middle Ages, government agencies preferred a checklist to common sense. 11. The Cat Bureaucracy. On British Royal Navy ships, cats were not pets. They were government employees. A ship's cat was entered into the official log, granted a food ration, and tasked with rat control. But the British Admiralty, in its infinite wisdom, applied strict bureaucracy to the feline workforce. If the cat died or fell overboard, it had to be formally reported in triplicate so its pay and food allowance could be immediately stopped. There is something profoundly British about a naval officer sitting by candlelight, filling out a death certificate for Mr. Whiskers, ensuring the Crown didn't waste a penny on a deceased mouser. 12. The Legal Cat Defense. The Consolat de Mar, a 14th century maritime code, contained a specific legal loophole regarding rodents. If rats destroyed a merchant's cargo, the ship's captain was liable for the cost, unless he could prove he had a cat on board. The presence of a cat was a legal shield. If the cat was present but lazy, the captain could still be sued. This turned the ship's cat into a critical legal asset. Imagine a courtroom drama where the defense rests entirely on the work ethic of a tabby. It was a rule that monetized the predator-prey relationship. 13. The Rat Guard Hat. Every massive vessel, from aircraft carriers to container ships, is legally required to wear tiny metal hats on its ropes. These are rat guards, metal discs designed to stop rodents from tightrope walking from the dock to the ship. While scientifically sound, the visual is absurd. You have a nuclear-powered warship, capable of leveling a city, protected from invasion by a piece of galvanized tin that looks like a harsh party hat. It is a regulation that acknowledges a humiliating truth. No matter how advanced our technology, we are still fighting a medieval war against rats, and the rats are usually winning. 14. The Captain's God Complex. For centuries, maritime law enshrined the captain as a floating deity. Once a ship left port, the captain's word superseded all civil rights. He was the judge, jury, executioner, and priest. He could legally flog a man for laziness, marry a couple temporarily, and confiscate property. This lack of checks and balances meant that a ship wasn't a workplace. It was a dictatorship. The rule assumed that rank equaled sanity, a dangerous gamble that often left 30 men trapped in the middle of the Atlantic at the mercy of a syphilitic maniac with a god complex. 15. The Dead Horse Ritual. Sailors had a bizarre, rule-bound ritual for debt. Because they were paid a month's wages in advance, which they immediately spent on booze and women, they effectively worked the first month at sea for free. This period was called working off the dead horse. The moment that month ended, a ceremony was mandatory. The crew would build a straw horse, beat it, set it on fire, and throw it into the ocean. It was a legally sanctioned act of performance art, a violent celebration of the moment they stopped being indentured servants and started being paid employees again. 16. The Blinker Ban. Until 2007, the state of Kentucky held on to a maritime rule that feels like a glitch in the simulation. It was explicitly illegal to name your boat Blinker. The terrifying part? Nobody knows why. Legal scholars and historians have no idea what Blinker referred to or why it was banned. It was a zombie law, a mindless regulation wandering through the books for decades, preventing boat owners from using a specific name for absolutely no reason. It was finally repealed, but it stands as a monument to legislative inertia. 17. The Font Police. There are incredibly specific international standards regarding the typography of a ship's name. The International Maritime Organization doesn't care about your aesthetic. The letters must be a specific height, contrast, and location. This regulation crushes creativity with a caliper. A billionaire can buy a mega yacht with a helicopter pad and a shark tank, but he cannot write the name Ocean's Pleasure in Comic Sans. Actually, that might be the only good regulation on this list. It proves that while you can buy the ocean, you cannot buy your way out of the font police. 18. The Paint Manual. In the 1990s, the U.S. Navy's obsession with the color Haze Gray spiraled into madness. There wasn't just a rule to paint ships gray. There were volumes of regulations detailing the exact chemical composition, application method, and permissible fade levels of that specific gray. Entire careers were built on inspecting the nuances of this single drab color. It is the ultimate triumph of military bureaucracy, taking the most boring color in the visible spectrum and wrapping it in enough red tape to strangle a whale. 19. The Jones Act Racket. The Jones Act of 1920 is a masterclass in protectionism gone wrong. It requires that goods shipped between U.S. ports be carried on ships built, owned, and crewed by Americans. It sounds patriotic, but the economics are idiotic. It is often cheaper to ship cattle from Texas to Europe than to ship them to Puerto Rico. This rule artificially inflates the cost of living for island territories and creates a bizarre logistical map where it's easier to trade with enemies than with your own countrymen. It is a century-old ghost haunting the supply chain. 20. The Right of Wreck. In medieval Europe, the right of wreck was a law that essentially legalized land-based piracy. It stated that a landowner could claim any ship and cargo that washed up on their beach. This created a perverse incentive structure. Why help a ship in distress when you can wait for it to crash and legally steal everything? It led to wrecking, where locals would set up false lights to lure ships onto the rocks. The law didn't just allow theft. It incentivized mass murder by turning the coastline into a trap and the locals into vultures. 21. The Salvage Dilemma. The modern law of salvage isn't much better. It dictates that rescuing an abandoned ship entitles the rescuer to a massive financial reward based on the value of the hull and cargo. This creates a moral hazard that belongs in a game theory textbook. If a tugboat captain sees a ship in trouble, the most profitable move is to wait until the crew abandons it before latching on. Saving the people makes you a nice guy. Saving the empty ship makes you rich. The law essentially asks captains to gamble with other people's lives for a paycheck. 22. General average. General average is a maritime legal principle that sounds like a communist manifesto written by capitalists. It states that if cargo must be thrown overboard to save the ship during a storm, all merchants with cargo on board must split the cost of the loss. Imagine the scene. A ship is listing 45 degrees, waves are crushing the deck, and the captain is supposed to be doing complex financial arbitration. We need to dump the BMWs to save the bananas, but the banana guy has to pay the BMW guy. It attempts to impose accounting logic onto a chaotic survival situation. 23. The pirate gamble. We tend to think of pirates as chaotic anarchists, but ships like those of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, had stricter rules than the Royal Navy. One of the most bewildering was a total ban on gambling. No cards, no dice for money. Think about that. These men risked hanging every single day. Their entire life was a wager against the gallows. Yet, the captain decided that a game of poker was too disruptive for morale. It was a rule that said, "Murder and theft are fine, but I draw the line at blackjack." 24. Friendly fire. Treason. An old British law made it a capital offense to associate with pirates. It sounds reasonable until you look at the fine print. The law was so vague that you could be executed for having a beer with a man who later decided to become a pirate. It was retroactive guilt by association. It turned every tavern conversation into a potential death sentence. You weren't just choosing a drinking buddy. You were betting your neck that he wouldn't make a bad career change in the next 5 years. 25. Letters of marque. Governments have always been hypocrites, but the letter of marque formalized it. This document turned a pirate into a privateer. It was a license to rob and murder, provided you only targeted the enemy's ships and gave the king a cut of the loot. It proves that in maritime law the only difference between a criminal and a patriot is the paperwork. If you rob a ship without the note, you hang. If you rob a ship with the note, you get a knighthood. It was state-sponsored terrorism with a wax seal. 26. False colors. Naval warfare had a gentleman's agreement regarding deception. It was perfectly legal to fly a fake flag to lure an enemy closer. But the rule, the honor among murderers, was that you had to haul down the fake flag and raise your true colors moments before firing. It was a rule of etiquette in the middle of carnage. It effectively said, "It is fine to lie to these men, entrap them, and prepare to blow them to shreds, but it would be simply rude not to introduce ourselves 1 second before the massacre." 27. The women on board paradox. The superstition that women on ships caused storms was treated as a de facto law for centuries. The logic was that the ship, a she, would get jealous. However, the hypocrisy was breathtaking. The rule usually had a carve-out for the captain's wife or royalty. Furthermore, almost every ship featured a bare-breasted wooden woman carved into the figurehead for good luck. So, a wooden woman was a charm, but a breathing one was a curse. It was a rule that tried to navigate the ocean with the navigational aid of fragile masculinity. 28. The figurehead eye exam. Speaking of figureheads, there was a deeply held rule that the carved statue was the eyes of the ship. Sailors believed the wooden woman literally guided the vessel through the fog. Consequently, damaging the paint on the figurehead's eyes was considered a Class A emergency. You could have a hole in the hull, but if the wooden lady had a scratch on her pupil, the crew would panic. It was a safety regulation based entirely on the belief that a block of pine had 20/20 vision. 29. The tattoo life insurance. Sailors created their own unofficial regulations written in ink. The pig and rooster rule dictated that a sailor must tattoo a pig on one foot and a rooster on the other. Why? Because crates carrying these animals often floated when ships sank. The logic was that God, seeing the animals on the sailors' feet, would be confused or compassionate and allow the sailor to float too. It was a desperate attempt to hack the laws of physics with a superstition, treating a tattoo like a mystical life jacket. 30. The No Banana Decree. To this day, captains of sport fishing boats enforce a strict no bananas rule. It is not a joke. If you bring a banana boat sunscreen or a fruit salad, you might be left on the dock. The origins are murky. Some say bananas hid spiders, others say they spoil other fruit. But the enforcement is religious. I have seen grown men, hardened captains, scream in terror at a yellow curved fruit as if it were a stick of dynamite. It is a modern superstition enforced with the rigor of a federal statute. 31. The Friday Prohibition. For centuries, an unwritten law paralyzed ports. Never set sail on a Friday. This was the day Christ was crucified, and starting a voyage then guaranteed doom. This wasn't just a quirky belief. It had real economic impact. Cargo rotted on docks and crews sat idle because the calendar said Friday. It was a global shipping schedule dictated by bad vibes. The British Navy allegedly tried to debunk this by launching a ship named HMS Friday, on a Friday, commanded by Captain Friday. Legend says it disappeared without a trace. The story is a myth, but the fear was very real. 32. The Whistling Ban. Whistling on a ship was legally indistinguishable from attempting to sink it. The belief was that whistling whistled up a wind. It was a sympathetic magic rule. Only the cook was allowed to whistle, because the belief was that as long as he was whistling, he wasn't eating the rations. For everyone else, pursing your lips was a punishable offense. Imagine a workplace where a cheerful tune is interpreted as an act of meteorological terrorism. 33. Stirring up trouble. The knife in the tea rule was a micro-regulation of the galley. You must never stir your tea with a knife. The rhyme went, stir with a knife, stir up strife. It implies that the tool of violence, the knife, would infect the peaceful beverage, the tea. It turned a utensil drawer into a minefield of dark magic, where using the wrong silverware could theoretically cause a mutiny. 34. The Beards of the Admiralty. The British Navy's relationship with facial hair was a bureaucratic farce. You couldn't just stop shaving. You had to submit a formal request to stop shaving. You were then given 2 weeks to grow a full set. After this trial period, a senior officer would inspect your face. If the beard was patchy, thin, or just ugly, you were ordered to shave it off immediately. It was a state-sponsored beauty pageant for men, where a captain could legally judge the masculinity of your follicles. 35. The Hairy Leg Law. Wait, let's use the name-changing rule here. Changing a ship's name is considered an act of war against the gods. To do it legally in the eyes of superstition, you must follow a strict protocol. Purge the old name from every ledger, life ring, and stern, and then pour expensive alcohol into the sea. It is a rule that combines OCD cleaning with alcohol abuse. You are essentially bribing Poseidon with champagne to look the other way while you rebrand your boat. 36. The boat versus ship semantics. Naval etiquette includes a verbal landmine, the boat versus ship distinction. Calling a ship a boat is a grave insult, implying it is a small, useless dinghy. The rule is, a ship can carry a boat, but a boat cannot carry a ship. However, submariners, the weirdos of the fleet, insist on calling their nuclear-powered leviathans boats. It is a linguistic trap designed solely to allow old sailors to feel superior to civilians. It is semantic gatekeeping at its finest. 37. Port and starboard only. The words left and right are illegal at sea. You must use port and starboard. While this makes sense for orientation, left changes depending on where you face, port is always port, the social enforcement is brutal. If you say left on a bridge, the officer will look at you with the pity usually reserved for a dog walking into a glass door. It is a safety rule that has mutated into a shibboleth, a way to instantly identify who belongs to the tribe and who is just a tourist. 38. The Crossing the Line Assault. The crossing the line. Ceremony is a tradition that became a mandatory hazing ritual. When a ship crosses the equator, polywogs, rookies, must be initiated by shellbacks, veterans. In the modern Navy, this involves billion-dollar warships pausing their mission so grown men can dress in drag, crawl through garbage, and worship a fat guy dressed as King Neptune. It is a sanctioned mental breakdown where military discipline is suspended so everyone can engage in a weird, wet frat party. 39. The gunpowder cocktail. The British Navy issued a daily rum ration called grog. But to ensure the purser wasn't watering it down, they used a proof rule involving gunpowder. They mixed the rum with gunpowder and focused a magnifying glass on it. If it ignited, it was 100% proof. If it fizzled, the rum was too weak. This means the official quality control method for their beverage involved high explosives. They were literally drinking a liquid that passed a flammability test. 40. The toxic lemonade. The Royal Navy mandated lemon juice to fight scurvy. Smart, right? But the regulation was flawed by bad science. They didn't know why it worked, vitamin C, so they stored the juice in copper-lined barrels. The chemical reaction destroyed the vitamin C and created a toxic copper compound. So, they enforced a rule to force-feed sailors a cure that was not only useless but actively poisonous. It is the perfect metaphor for government aid: expensive, mandatory, and slightly toxic. 41. The hardtack protocol. The regulations regarding food rations were grim. Hardtack, a biscuit as dense as a brick, was the staple. The unofficial rule for eating it was, don't look. The biscuits were almost always infested with weevils. Sailors had two choices: tap the biscuit to knock the bugs out, eating cold, or eat in the dark, eating protein. It was a dining etiquette based on willful ignorance. 42. The best meal, but worst wine. Old maritime rules required a captain to dine with his first mate once a week to maintain harmony. However, the rule explicitly stated the captain did not have to share his best wine. This resulted in the most passive-aggressive dinner dates in history. The first mate had to sit there, eating the captain's roast while watching the captain drink a vintage Bordeaux while he sipped vinegar. It was a rule designed to reinforce hierarchy through beverage envy. 43. No deck chair reservations. Modern cruise law attempts to ban chair hogging, the act of leaving a towel on a pool chair at 6 a.m. It is the most violated treaty in the world. Despite signs, announcements, and threats, the towel rule is universally ignored. It represents the failure of authority against the sheer pettiness of vacationers. It is a polite civil war fought with terry cloth, proving that anarchy reigns supreme at the buffet. 44. The mandatory drill. The muster drill is a modern ritual of compliance. International law demands that before sailing, thousands of passengers must stand in a grid wearing orange vests, listening to a safety briefing they are ignoring. It is a piece of theater. In a real emergency, panic would reign. But for 20 minutes, we all pretend that we would calmly follow the instructions of a 22-year-old dancer from the entertainment team. It is a regulation that solves liability, not survival. 45. The Dutch marriage. For a brief time, Dutch captains had the authority to perform marriages at sea. The catch: the marriage was only valid for the duration of the voyage. The moment the couple stepped on land, the marriage dissolved. It was the Vegas wedding of the 17th century. It allowed for a guilt-free, legally sanctioned fling that expired like a carton of milk the moment you hit the dock. It was a rule that understood the fleeting nature of romance better than any poet. 46. 8 bells. Time at sea is not measured by clocks, but by bells. The rule dictates a bell is struck every half hour. 8 bells means the watch is over. In an era of atomic clocks and GPS time, the Navy still clings to a rule that involves hitting a piece of brass with a hammer to tell the time. It is a charming, obsolete adherence to tradition, ensuring that even on a stealth destroyer, everyone wakes up to the sound of a boxing match starting. 47. The singing mandate. Sea shanties were not just folk songs. They were a labor management technology. The rhythm of the song synchronized the pulling of ropes, but this made singing mandatory. Imagine being freezing, wet, starving, and exhausted, and the bosun screams at you to sing louder. It weaponized music. It was the world's most miserable compulsory karaoke, where if you didn't hit the high note, the sail didn't go up and you got flogged. 48. The official playing cards. In 18th century England, a tax law made it illegal for sailors to use unofficial playing cards. If a customs officer found a non-stamped deck of cards on your ship, he could legally seize the entire vessel. Let that sink in. You could lose a 3-masted schooner and 50 tons of cargo because you wanted to play solitaire with a bootleg deck. It was a disproportionate punishment that makes modern civil forfeiture look reasonable. 49. The temporary widow. There was a powerful superstition turned rule. The last person to board the ship would be the first to die. This wasn't a joke, it caused riots on the gangplank. Grown men would shove, kick, and scramble to avoid being the tail gunner. It was a self-imposed regulation of chaos, ensuring that the voyage began with a violent brawl before the ropes were even cast off. 50. The human fool. Ultimately, the dumbest rule isn't written on paper, it's written in our DNA. We believe that if we write enough rules, we can control the uncontrollable. We put hats on ropes to stop rats. We paint lines on hulls to stop greed. We pickle admirals in brandy to stop decay. The ocean ignores them all. The sea remains the ultimate anarchist, laughing at our little books of regulations, waiting to swallow the ship, the captain, the cat, and the rulebook all in one gulp. Conclusion. In the grand theater of human folly, these 50 points serve as a wet, salty reminder that authority often masks absurdity. We built ships to conquer the horizon, but we burdened them with the weight of our own neuroses, our fear of Fridays, our hatred of bananas, and our desperate need to categorize the chaos. The ocean has never read our laws, and it never will. Yet, we keep writing them, painting our lines and scraping our tongues, hoping that if we just find the right form to fill out, the storm will pass us by. It won't. But at least we'll have our paperwork in order when we sink. So, tell us, what is the single most pointless rule you have to follow in your daily life? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this dive into the deep end of stupidity, hit subscribe. We're going to need a bigger boat.